Number 10. Thor and Hela. Starting off with an example of why the Ultimate Universe does some unnecessary stuff from time to time, Thor was forced to kill his supervillain's son to save America from civil war. But what's funny, well not funny, is that wasn't even the unnecessary part. So it begins in the aftermath of an event called Ultimatum, which we will get to much later on. Basically, Ultimate Thor ends up sacrificing his own life to save his lover, Valkyrie. While in the afterlife, in order to be reunited with and save Valkyrie, the goddess Hela makes Thor fight a whole army of undead soldiers, which he does. But then Thor asks what else he needs to do, and this goddess just starts undressing herself and demanding that Thor gives her a baby. Which, of course he does, and it doesn't even save Valkyrie. This comes back later with the child, Modi Thor's son, being raised by a much more villainous Loki, feeling abandoned and seeking revenge, trying to turn America into a new Asgard while wielding an Infinity Stone and forcing Thor to eventually strike down his own evil son. Number 9. Look what they did to my boy! Almost everyone loves Deadpool. Weirdly, even some moms love Deadpool. So when the gritty, realistic, mature Ultimate Universe was going to bring the character in, you'd expect it to be a match made in heaven. No! I blame this version of the character for the monstrosity we got 3 years later in 2009's X-Men Origins Wolverine. The ultimate Marvel version of Deadpool was a sergeant in the military named Wade Wilson. He's grim, he's angry, he's way too serious, and he also is an incredibly racist mutant hater. Oh, he was also a cyborg with incredible strength, he retained his signature healing factor, and instead of just being disfigured, he had no skin at all. And he's missing part of his skull, so his head is instead encased in a clear plastic case for everyone to see. Deadpool leads the Reavers, who are also racist, in trying to kill prominent mutants. Thankfully, Ultimate Deadpool was taken off the board by the 616 Deadpool in Deadpool Kills Deadpool in 2013. Number 8. Hank Pym needs to chill. Hank Pym has not really ever been that great of a dude. He has multiple untreated mental disorders and crazy insecurities that have caused him to do multiple not so great things in his time in the regular universe. But of course, everything in the Ultimate Universe gets ramped up a bit. Pym got involved in a very heated argument with his wife, Janet Van Dyne, over her friendship with Captain America. In Ultimates issue number 6, things start to get physical until the Wasp shrinks down to her smaller size to get away from her husband. Unfortunately, the terribly insecure Hank cornered her and sprayed her wasp-sized self with bug spray. She hid under a desk to catch her breath after inhaling the toxic fumes, while her husband just kept on with the emotional bombardment. But he didn't stop there. He then sent an army of ants after her until he realized what he was doing to his own wife. This stuff kind of boils my blood just a little bit. The fight resulted in Janet's very near death, her hospitalization, and his expulsion from the Ultimates. Number 7. Making the Maker. The Fantastic Four in the Ultimate Universe remained relatively the same, at least in their family dynamics. Their backstory was slightly modified, but overall the four main heroes lived as you'd expect, until it all went Mar-Vell Ultimate-y. First off, Sue Storm and Reed Richards lost a child together, but then Reed Richards proposed to Susan Storm and she rejected his proposal. Just like that, the Fantastic Four was no more, but that's not the end. What came next, really quickly I might add, was Reed going absolutely bonkers, faking his death, de-lifing his family, planning alien terror plots around the world, being trapped in the negative zone where he primed his intellect by stretching his brain and skull, and he built an army. Since he was horribly burnt by the Human Torch, Reed took to wearing a helmet and founded the Children of Tomorrow, the Dark Ultimates, and he called himself the Maker. He became an incredibly evil Reed Richards. Number 6. Cap hates France? Look, despite the name, Captain America, Steve Rogers, is very much a protector of the world, not just America. So it was really odd when in Ultimates number 12 from Mark Miller, Brian Hitch, and Paul Neary, we see the Ultimate Marvel Universe Captain America verbally wailing on France, of all places. Captain America is caught in a fight with Herr Kleiser, an old German rival. Just for better context, Nick Fury is there too. Captain America is obviously the hero though, so eventually he gets the upper hand. It was just so odd that when Kleiser was pinned by Cap and asking for surrender, well, Cap digs his shield into the dude's stomach and says, says, "Surrender? Surrender? You think this letter on my head stands for France?" The comment was kind of fueled by the time period it was written in, as the states were entering into a war and France refused to join them, leading to some anti-France feelings in the real world. But this World War II era dig at the country left a bad taste in pretty much everyone's mouth, especially from a character that is supposed to be much, much better than that. Number 5. Wolverine. Why are you so weird? Look, I'm gonna get into all the weirdness that is the Ultimate Universe Wolverine in a sec, but one thing that kind of immediately sticks out is how this version of Wolverine seems to repeatedly swing for ladies that are a little below his age bracket, or like a lot below, and always redheads, which I guess kinda checks out from the 616 version too. Jean Grey, Firestar, and the one we're talking about today, Mary Jane Watson. In Ultimate Spider-Man number 66, Wolverine and Peter Parker end up switching bodies after Wolverine makes some unwanted advances on the teenage Jean Grey, who psychically swapped their bodies. I don't know why she did that, but she did it. Wolverine finds some drawbacks, but apparently they pale in comparison to the perk that is the teenage Peter's girlfriend, Mary Jane. Wolverine tells MJ that he, in Peter's body, doesn't need to go to school, while also making some crude advances towards her as well. It comes off as kinda creepy and really cringy. Number 4. Wolverine. How you die. Now, on the topic of Wolverine, he himself has quite a few moments that make him kinda awesome and some that make him kinda horrible. Ultimate Wolverine is no longer feral, and he does not have the classic healing factor. Instead, he gets the survival factor, which is kind of a heck of a lot better. He can survive a heck of a lot, almost anything. S.H.I.E.L.D. chopped his body off, leaving only his head, and he breathed through his skin. They put his head in a vacuum and he went into stasis. Hulk ripped his body and threw it into another mountain range, and when Wolverine found that half, it was still fresh, no organ failure, no rot, and the blood was somehow still pumping. And he just put himself back together again with no issues. Ultimate Wolverine is unkillable by any means, no matter what you do. It was also implied that Ultimate Wolverine was the precursor of all mutants. He was sort of the first mutant in the world. So all the other mutants are basically products of Weapon X experimentation on Wolverine. On top of that, his blood could be synthesized into a substance that gives mutants insane power boosts. Mar-Vell made Ultimate Wolverine insanely overpowered, and then they absolutely killed him in the stupidest way possible. He died because Magneto did a hand wave thingamajig, as someone on Reddit said, and apparently he destroyed every single one of Wolverine's cells while ripping out his adamantium. Number 3. Is this Game of Thrones? If you haven't noticed by some of the previous points, Mar-Vell did a lot of unnecessary sexualizing of the Ultimate Universe. And to just push it a bit further into unnecessary odd choices made by Mar-Vell for this universe, they included the incestuous relationship between the characters of Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. Somehow it actually feels worse than the one in Game of Thrones, maybe just because it was extremely shocking and the two characters never had anything even similar to this in the 616 continuity. Fans wondered whether it was really necessary for Mark Millar to pair the two characters together and questioned whether the twist added anything new to the story at all. Answer: it didn't. Probably the biggest issue with this revelation is that now the characters can't so much as look at each other without fans accusing the writers of returning to the incest plot from the Ultimate X-Men. Number 2. Blob. After the events of that ultimatum thing, which I'm so close to talking about, many heroes were taken out and or unaccounted for. One such hero would be Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp. Now, as we know, Hank Pym, Ant-Man, was kind of the worst. And though a terrible husband, he still diligently looked for his missing wife. What he found instead was the villain the Blob feasting on her remains. It's probably one of the most striking images from the whole Ultimate Universe, but it just gets stranger and somehow worse. Enraged at the sight of it, Ant-Man converted to his giant man state and picked up the Blob in his giant hand and bit Blob's head clean off and spat it on the ground to the shock and horror of his teammates. And in at number 1 is Ultimatum. Ultimatum was supposed to be how the writers finished off the Ultimate Universe stories. Obviously it didn't turn out that way, but as you can tell from previous points, writers kinda just went a little haywire with things they would do with a dying universe story. Basically, Magneto, who has been a pretty brutal villain in this universe so far, goes even farther during the mega event where stakes were way high. Basically, after Magneto gains control of the Hammer of Thor and is manipulated by none other than Dr. Doom, he messes with the magnetic pillars of the world, flipping them on their head and sending weather into a frenzy. The big event was a giant tsunami called the Ultimatum Wave that basically put New York underwater and brought a giant casualty list along with it. Bruce Banner drowns but the Hulk lives, the Wasp gets eaten, as mentioned before, and Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch are killed off. In a bit more of a divisive move, while the X-Men are looking for their fallen teammates in the wake of the tidal wave in New York, Magneto pays a visit to Professor X and in a pretty brutal scene, snaps the professor's neck. Magneto also rips the adamantium from Wolverine's skeleton and pretty much disintegrates him like we talked about before.
In at number 10, Sugar Man. One of the ugliest villains, the Sugar Man is a low-key supervillain making appearances in the 1995 X-Men crossover Age of Apocalypse, and in the Mar-Vell universe as well. He's a murderer of mutants, humans, and financially motivated. His monstrous and deformed appearance just wouldn't look right on the big screen MCU films. Even with great CGI, his demonic body would be difficult to illustrate and may look pretty strange next to the human cast in an X-Men film. Number 9, the Impossible Man. First appearing in the pages of the Fantastic Four, this antagonistic alien is just unfilmable in nature. Despite Fantastic Four movie dreams being wiped out because Mar-Vell no longer owns the rights, the often playful villain just hasn't been updated enough for our modern time. When he debuted in the 60s, he was a good fit next to his hero counterparts. However, picturing him in a modern Mar-Vell movie just doesn't seem likely. Number 8, Orgo. This classic Mar-Vell villain first hit the comic book pages of Strange Tales in 1961. Although temporarily, he successfully took over the world and has even been a member of the Howling Commandos and Stake, which was actually a division of S.H.I.E.L.D. The reason why his comic book run was so successful is purely on how dramatic and colorful the character appears on the pages. Slap that on a big screen and it probably wouldn't translate well. He's just too much of a monster that most people don't really remember. In at number 7, the Beyonder. In the popular 1984 crossover event known as Secret Wars, the Beyonder was the main antagonist. He's a mysterious out-of-this-world force that was originally believed to be the sum of the entire multiverse. His reality-altering powers makes it pretty hard to believe that he could hit the MCU as a large-scale villain. Even though the MCU has shown this watered-down Thanos character, he doesn't even hold a candle to this 1980s bad guy. Number 6, MODOK. Also known as a mobile organism designed only for killing, this hard-to-look-at villain makes you feel okay about judging people based on their looks. He's one of those villains that looks as bad as what he does. MODOK is the OG of floating around and killing people as far back as 1967. Taking into consideration his disturbing appearance and unique character design, it's not a surprise that the MCU hasn't introduced him yet. To make that happen, it would take a ton of CGI work, and with the failure of other big-headed villains like Hector Hammond, it's probably best that he stays on the comic book pages. Number 5, Mojo. Making MODOK look like someone your parents would trust you to go on a date with, we have a member of an alien race known as the Spineless Ones. He is a longtime villain for the X-Men and rules over a dimensions where the inhabitants are addicted to his gladiator-esque television broadcasts. Now imagine this science fiction villain up against Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. Put his origin aside, he's a huge, hideous horror film type character that would be difficult for the MCU to adapt. Not to mention, you'd also have to show off his big jelly body on top of his spider-like robotic legs. Up next to X-Men's big villains like Magneto and Apocalypse, this ugly monster whose personality is more like a TV executive just wouldn't hold up. Number 4, Onslaught. Leaning on one of the least realistic villains in the Mar-Vell universe, Onslaught would be like mixing the consciousness of Charles Xavier and Magneto. His power in the comic books was only matched by the combined efforts of the Avengers, X-Men, and the Fantastic Four. That group effort was able to take him down in his original 1996 crossover event. This big red and purple supervillain would be a tough sell to adapt into the MCU because of his physical stature and combination of two minds. On top of that, his costume is just impractical and hard to imagine into live action. Number 3, Death. Now, it's argued that Death isn't a supervillain, but considering her name is Death, this abstract entity of the Mar-Vell universe certainly isn't up to any good. Death has been part of some big storylines such as the death of Captain Mar-Vell and Infinity Gauntlet. Death has attachments to many big Mar-Vell characters. Most of them have a strange relationship with the Force. Even Thanos is obsessed with Death. Deadpool, however, avoids it altogether. To adapt the Force of Death and mold it into a supervillain for the big screen would be just a little too much. It would be like if you actually got to see Batman and Titans. The point is that the force of death is always there without needing it to be there physically. Number 2, high evolutionary. With his ever-changing personality, confusing principles, and seldom use, this villain is just too old school for the big screen. Using his godlike powers since 1966, the high evolutionary has an obsession with changing the evolutionary process. This all makes him very unlikely to be battling it out with the Avengers and company. Considering the lighthearted vibes of most of the MCU films, this villain that raises questions of morality and messes with the evolutionary process makes for some heavy material. Plus, the character's backstory is extremely complicated. Combined with his motivations, it just wouldn't translate to the silver screen. Lastly, on our number 1 spot, Mar-Vell zombies. I know what you're thinking. There's no way we consider zombified versions of heroes to be villains, but you'd be wrong. They are most certainly villains in the comic books because, well, they literally eat people. This would make for a very entertaining cameo for the MCU to infect a few heroes with this zombie contagion, but it also wouldn't make any sense. Adding in zombies would certainly alienate their younger demographic in the audience by doing a live-action zombie version of their childhood heroes, even if us older viewers would love it.
Number 10. Morbius. Michael Morbius, or Morbius the Living Vampire, first appeared in The Amazing Spider-Man 101 back in 1971. He was a Nobel Prize winning scientist who suffered from a blood disease and was experimenting to find a cure using vampire bats, because of course he was. Side effects of this turned him into a mutate with characteristics quite similar to those of a vampire, especially in the appearance department. He was depicted with stark white skin, huge red eyes, and large fangs. He actually appeared right after the Comics Code Authority lifted the ban on vampires and other supernatural creatures. Yes, there was a creature ban. He's so low not because these days few people find vampires scary, but because he always tended towards the sympathetic anti-hero side, looking for a cure for his ailment, and driven by desperation about his deteriorating health. Ultimately, he goes the anti-hero route, and that greatly lowers the fear factor, for me at least. Number 9. Dormammu. This character first appeared in Strange Tales number 126 back in 1964. Most will remember this character as a prominent antagonist for Doctor Strange. He is the Lord of the Realm of Darkness, and is particularly intimidating not just because of his design, but also because he can wreak havoc from beyond his dimension with messengers and minions set out to do his bidding. Dormammu is a mystical entity comprised of mystic energy, whom Strange fears. However, he loses some major fear points for something that happened in the early days. He loses a martial arts battle to Mordo, a battle that he set up, and in the process for a time he could no longer return to the Earth realm. The thing with Dormammu is, despite all that power, he can be surprisingly easy to manipulate or bargain with. The ending of Doctor Strange in 2016 was pretty accurate.
Dormammu, I've come to bargain.
You cannot do this forever.
Actually, I can.
Number 8. Nightmare. Nightmare first appears in Strange Tales number 110 in 1963. He rules the dream dimension with an iron fist. Think an evil dream of the endless, or rather, think of Dream of the Endless as a good nightmare. He tortures humans while they sleep, poisoning their dreams. Despite this, Nightmare is a demon who actually needs humans to survive. For if they stop dreaming, he stops existing. Also, they would go insane. He's got that Fey Achilles heel. Fighting Nightmare is usually about keeping the world in balance and maintaining the sanity of humanity, although sometimes you deal in other realm dynamics. It's a scary concept, all Freddy Krueger and whatnot, but it can be difficult to implement in fresh and dynamic ways. At this point, we've seen it many times. Number 7. Terror Inc. So despite the fact that it may not feel like it today, there were and still are other genres of comic books. Enter Terror Inc., a horror comic. Terror is an immortal who absorbs the powers of others through their dismembered limbs. He first appeared in 1988 as the villain Shrek, and later in 1992 as Terror, which is a much better name to be honest. For a while, people thought they were two separate characters, but a Mar-Vell handbook in 2005 solved that canonical battle once and for all. They're the same. Terror is a demon who has existed through the ages, a dark being who slowly learned he could take on the attributes of others by absorbing their limbs. He has reinvented himself across the centuries, working for gangsters and drug dealers. He also still maintains a horrifying near-zombie appearance, or a melting man appearance. However, as time went on, he took on a more anti-heroish stance. He still clashes with some heroes now and then, but he's not quite the horrific creature he was at first inception. Number 6. Man-Thing. Man-Thing first appears in Savage Tales number 1 in 1971, and it's one of those instances where experimenting and gaining fantastic powers is treated as horrifying, which it oftentimes is. Ted Sallis was a scientist, a biochemist. He was trying to recreate the Captain America Super Soldier Serum, which always works out so well for people in the Marvel Universe. After being betrayed, he steals the last vial of the serum, injects himself, and later crashes into a magical swamp, where the combination of gross swamp chemicals, the serum, and magic turns him into Man-Thing. Now he is made up of mostly plant matter, and secretes a poison when upset, and also doesn't remember who he is, except for on rare occasions, forced to wander the world as a mindless monster. Thanks, Captain America. Things have changed a bit over the years, but many fans still consider the first Man-Thing run a horror classic. Number 5. Frankencastle. So comic book characters die and are resurrected. It's a thing. It's kinda hard to get mad or believe any death is permanent. In fact, sometimes it would almost be a relief if they were. All of this is to say, back in 2009, Frank Castle was killed by Wolverine's son, who has a name that fans still argue about how to pronounce, despite the author telling everyone how at a con. So Frank was reassembled as a Frankenstein monster by Morbius, and they called him Frankencastle, which sounds like a cereal. It comes with marshmallows, skulls, and guns. Morbius wanted him to lead the Legion of Monsters, but Frank didn't want to and instead dedicated himself to protecting innocent monsters. This series was interesting. It's not so much the concept of a Frankenstein Punisher that's frightening, but more thinking about the parallel universe where that was a permanent change. Terrifying. Number 4. Marvel Zombies. What's this? A cop-out, you say? How dare you? Marvel Zombies was a limited series that ran from late 2005 to mid-2006, and it was what it said on the tin. The Marvel Universe was zombies. This happened on Earth 2149. In this universe, the hunger had consumed the world, and the zombies were out of food. This series is all about watching heroes and villains alike get killed and eaten by zombies. Not literally, it has a plot, but come on, that's why most people read it. Don't lie. As an alternate universe story, this one is interesting and actually has some effort behind it and has spawned a couple of sequels. Zombies are played out for a lot of people, but there are some who genuinely find them scary. The concept of an unstoppable horde, and also just what that does to the world, living in constant fear. Also, what happens to the survivors? For some, it's quite compelling. Just look at how long they've managed to keep The Walking Dead on. Number 3. Dracula. Yes, Dracula is part of the Marvel Universe and has been since 1951, when he appeared in the comic Suspense number 7. However, the version of Dracula that has plagued Marvel heroes didn't appear till 1972, after they repealed the Supernatural ban and the ban on works based on pre-existing characters. Dracula has been steadily working to increase his power and remove the detriments of being a vampire to achieve true immortality, which would make him an even bigger threat. The thing with vampires is they have centuries to amass wealth, networks of people, worshippers, and more. If one is organized, they can have an entire secret cabal behind them before anyone even knows it. Dracula has raised a vampire army, he's fought the Avengers, and less frighteningly tried to stop his daughter from marrying Deadpool. Because really, Deadpool is great as a character, but who wouldn't want to try to stop that? Also, his head got thrown into the sun, but he'll be back. They always come back. Maybe he's back now. Number 2. Styx. Styx is a manifestation of one of Legion's personalities, who appears with a very mummified, evil, cursed pharaoh style design. Styx, like many of Legion's personalities, has a lot of issues, and this one wants to ascend to godhood by using an ability to warp reality that he plans to steal from Moira McTaggart. Styx highlights the complexity of David Haller's character, who in recent years has turned more and more anti-hero than villain, in that there are many things lurking inside of him that are still quite evil, and it just takes some kind of cataclysmic or magic occurrence or something like that for them to manifest in the world, which would put it in great danger. One hopes that this evil wraith will stay contained. Number 1. Mephisto. Mephisto first appeared back in The Silver Surfer number 3 in 1968, and was inspired by the character from Faust. Mephisto is essentially the Satan of the Marvel Universe, though not the only one. He has often functioned as a dark tempter. Just as the devil appeared to tempt Jesus in the desert, Mephisto will appear offering heroes all kinds of things, but for a price, and often a terrible one, and not just their souls. Few comic fans will ever forget how the character was used to retcon Peter and Mary Jane's marriage out of existence, so that the character could be single and essentially rebooted again. Mephisto is scary because he can be employed at the whims of writers and editors for the most terrifying comic event of all, extensive retconning. On the canon side, he has captured souls and kept them in his realm. He has partaken in the bad happenings of the history of the Marvel world that overlaps with our real world. and he's immortal. One More Day kind of ruined him for me though. Now whenever he shows up, it's just like, great, who's going back to issue 1 today?
Number 10. Betty Ross. In the comics, Betty Ross is one of the most important people in the Hulk's life. They have been in love since before Banner's accident, and is one of the few people who can reach Bruce when he is transformed into the Incredible Hulk. Betty has made one MCU appearance in the often ignored Incredible Hulk film, where she was played by Lord of the Rings alum Liv Tyler. In her one appearance, she managed to portray the mixture of caring for Bruce combined with terror at what he can become that the character needs. But she hasn't been seen on screen since 2008. In the time since in the MCU, Banner has been paired up with Black Widow and has never even mentioned Betty in any of the appearances he has had since. As far as we know, he never reached out to her during the period between Avengers 1 and 2 where the Hulk was largely accepted, or during the years after the snap, where he was able to learn to control the Hulk side of him. The thing that was keeping them apart to begin with. Betty's father, Thunderbolt Ross, has made a few appearances in the years since, but despite this, the character has never been alluded to in any major way since. This is a shame, as in the comics, she is a great character who also becomes the gamma-powered creatures Harpy and Red She-Hulk. With more Hulk and She-Hulk on the way, her dad's inclusion in the Thunderbolts, and the recent return of the Abomination from the 2008 film, maybe we will see Miss Ross again soon. Number 9. Mr. Fantastic. In Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, we got to see a few well-loved familiar faces, especially when we were introduced to the Illuminati. We got to see Captain Carter, we were reintroduced to Black Bolt after his disastrous appearance in the Inhumans show, and even Patrick Stewart as Professor X in his classic yellow chair. Most surprising was the appearance of one of the most consistent fan castings in MCU history, with John Krasinski appearing as Mr. Fantastic of the Fantastic Four. Obviously the Illuminati were pretty short-lived before they were all brutally killed by Wanda, but the briefness of Mr. Fantastic's appearance was especially disappointed, with him doing little to no stretching, telegraphing his team's plan to the Scarlet Witch, and being turned into spaghetti almost immediately. This isn't too bad, as it is meant to be a cameo appearance, and we are getting a Fantastic Four focused film quite soon, but Kevin Feige has heavily implied that Krasinski playing Reed was a one-time thing, and that the main Fantastic Four will have a different Mr. Fantastic. If that is the case, and he doesn't at least show up on the Council of Reeds, then I'd rather they had not used him at all. But while we're on the subject, my choice for Reed is Glenn Howerton from Always Sunny, with Miles Teller as the Maker. Number 8. Mar-Vell. In the comics, the original Captain Marvel was Billy Batson, but the original Captain Marvel in Marvel Comics was a Kree warrior named Mar-Vell. Mar-Vell came to Earth on a mission and took over the identity of a deceased Cape Canaveral scientist named Walter Lawson. While stationed there, he met the base's security chief, Carol Danvers, who he fell in love with. He soon became a superhero, calling himself Captain Marvel, and began protecting Earth, often accompanied by Carol, who went by Miss Marvel, among other identities. He was first introduced in 1967 and was a hero until his death from cancer in 2012. He's come back a couple times briefly, but his mantle has been passed down, and Carol became the new and current Captain Marvel a few months later. For the Captain Marvel movie, the decision was made to focus on Carol and have her be the one and only Captain Marvel in the MCU. A gender-swapped version of Mar-Vell appeared in the film played by Annette Bening, but she was killed off with only a few minutes of screen time. Now, I don't really care about the gender swap, and I've never had any interest in any Captain Marvel who doesn't have the powers of Shazam, but it's always sad when a character who operated as a hero for 45 years is turned into a throwaway character. And if there's anyone out there whose favorite superhero was Mar-Vell, I imagine it would really suck to see them be such a minor part of the movie. Number 7. Scorpion. First appearing in Amazing Spider-Man number 19 all the way back in 1964, Mac Gargan was a private eye who was hired by J. Jonah Jameson to follow Peter Parker around to discover how he managed to get such impressive pictures of Spider-Man. Due to his spider sense, Peter was able to avoid Gargan pretty easily, causing Jameson's scheme to fail. Jameson then paid Mac $10,000 to undergo an experiment that would put him in a green suit with a tail that would grant him the abilities of a scorpion. Jameson hoped to make a hero he could control to take out the webbed menace. Unfortunately, the formula drove Mac insane and he began attacking people, becoming the villain known as the Scorpion. Mac Gargan first showed up in live action in the MCU film Spider-Man Homecoming in a blink and you'll miss it cameo where he was a charismatic career criminal who did absolutely nothing but get knocked out by Spider-Man. But you know, that's fine. Homecoming already had a lot of villains with the Vulture, the Tinkerer, and 2 different versions of the Shocker showing up, and plus, he showed up in the post-credits scene claiming that he was gonna go after Spider-Man next time, but Spider-Man's next movie didn't have the Scorpion, and instead focused on Mysterio. But whatever. But then the next movie obviously had a lot going on, and didn't have time to bring in the Scorpion. But it does feel like a dangling plot thread that they may or may not get to, which is a real shame, because Gargan is played by Michael Mando, who is great in Better Call Saul, and would make a fantastic villain. He ranks pretty low on this list, as there is a chance he'll show up again at some point. Number 6. The Sinister Six. Speaking of Spider-Man villains, let's briefly talk about the Sinister Six. In the comics, the Sinister Six is a team of Spider-Man villains who have come together in order to try and defeat their adversary. It's a staple of the mythos, and Sony has been trying to get the Sinister Six in a movie for years since then. They seem to be charging ahead with the idea of a Sinister Six movie over at Sony that will likely feature Venom, Morbius, Kraven, and the Vulture among others, but we came this close to getting the Sinister Six in a movie that doesn't sound like a total train wreck in the recent Spider-Man Far From Home. Far From Home, as I unfortunately learned from a random TikTok a day before the movie came out in my country, features Tom Holland's Spider-Man teaming up with Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's versions of the character to battle villains from across the franchise's history. We got the return of the Green Goblin, Doc Ock, and Sandman from Tobey's movies, as well as Electro and the Lizard from the Garfield movies. We had 5 villains. We missed out on a multiversal Sinister Six by 1 villain. They could have brought back James Franco or Dane DeHaan's Harry Osborn's. Tom Hardy's Venom was even in the same universe, just hanging out on a beach at the time. Heck, I wouldn't have even minded Topher Grace's Venom coming back. Or, if you have to, bring back Vulture or Mysterio. I would even take the Rhino. Sure, the movie was already dealing with a lot, but it's not like Sandman or Lizard got a lot to do anyway. It just feels like a weird choice for us to be stuck with a Sinister 5 when it wouldn't have been that hard to add 1 more villain. Number 5. Nuke. In the comics, Nuke is a former Vietnam soldier named Frank Simpson, who was subjected to experiments in a rather sloppy attempt to replicate the Captain America Super Soldier program. His body was enhanced and he was given red, white, and blue pills that would regulate his adrenaline, giving him an edge in combat. He is quite insane and is used by the US government as someone they can drop into situations where they want everyone killed, as Nuke still thinks he's in the war and fighting for his country. In the Netflix Jessica Jones series, which is set in the MCU, it's in just this weird place canon-wise. Nuke is a former soldier who has become a police officer named Will Simpson. He develops a relationship with Trish Walker and is helping Jessica to hunt down Kilgrave. After almost being killed in an explosion, his former government doctor gave him similar red, white, and blue pills to help him recover. He went a bit nutty, but wasn't nearly as dangerous as Nuke in the comics, which is already a bit of a waste. What's worse is that at the end of the first season, it seems to be setting him up as a major antagonist for season 2, but when season 2 came out, he was unceremoniously killed 2 episodes into the season. With the canon of the Netflix shows being kinda iffy, and one of Nuke's major appearances, Daredevil Born Again, being adapted into a Disney Plus show, maybe Nuke will finally get his chance to shine. Number 4. The Prowler. In the comics, Aaron Davis is the uncle of the second Spider-Man, Miles Morales. He also operates as the villain, the Prowler, often coming into conflict with his nephew. His story was explored pretty much perfectly in the movie Into the Spider-Verse, but this was not his only big screen appearance. In Spider-Man Homecoming, Spider-Man interrupts an arms deal between a version of Davis played by Donald Glover and ends up saving the criminal's life. Later, Spider-Man webs him to a car and gets information about the Vulture from him, but that is the last we see of Davis. He doesn't give off supervillain vibes at all, and it doesn't feel like they're setting him up as a future villain, although he does name-check Miles, so that's kinda fun. This isn't just a waste of a good villain, it's a waste of Donald Glover, who would be great as so many different Marvel characters. Number 3. Flash Thompson. In the comics and in all of the movies, Flash Thompson is Peter Parker's high school bully. In most versions, he's kind of a jock who will make fun of Peter or beat him up. In the MCU, he's still a bully, but he's more a modern version who will make fun of Peter online and is kind of a loser. I actually like this change. It's how bullying actually works in this day and age. I should know, you guys bully me in the comments all the time. The only issue with this is that in the comics, Flash ends up becoming a Black Ops military officer who ends up taking on the Venom symbiote and becoming Agent Venom. As much as I like MCU Flash, I don't think it would be very believable for him to go down that path. Number 2. Gore the God Butcher. For all its faults, Thor Love and Thunder gets the broad strokes of Gore the God Butcher's character right. He hates the gods and is intent on using his Necro Sword to kill all of them. The details are a bit different between versions, but that's that's all present in some shape. What makes Gore a wasted character is the fact that other than his opening scene, we never get to see him do any god butchering. He gets very little to do, which is even more of a shame because they were able to get Christian Bale, one of the greatest working actors, to play him, and then barely had him in the movie. Number 1. Quicksilver. Quicksilver is one of, if not the, fastest man alive in the Marvel Comics universe. Most would say he definitely is, but I think Northstar from Alpha Flight might have something to say about that. He first appeared all the way back in 1964's X-Men number 4, where he was a member of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, along with his sister Scarlet Witch. He has been both villain and hero, being a member of the Avengers and being an important Marvel character. In the MCU, he was in one movie, before being shot by a bunch of bullets that he really should have been able to outrun. He never showed up again, until a mind-blowing scene in the WandaVision show, which seemed to imply that he had returned, being played not by Aaron Taylor Johnson, but by his multiversal counterpart, played by Evan Peters. Unfortunately, this turned out not to be the case, and Evan Peters was actually just playing a hypnotized actor named Ralph Boner.
In March of 2011, Sean Funk, a shovel operator at a mine in Fort McMurray, Alberta, was digging when he made an amazing discovery. A discovery that turned out to be Alberta's oldest dinosaur fossil and one of the best preserved ever found in the entire world. Honestly, this has to be the most amazing dinosaur discovery that I've ever read about. And I think Don Henderson, curator of dinosaurs at the Royal Tyrrell Museum, agrees, saying at the time, "Right away we knew it was going to be something good, but we had no idea how good it was going to be." So after getting the fossil back to the museum, Don and his team got to work, and 6 years later the dinosaur was named Borealopelta markmicheli. The name Borealopelta means shield of the north, and the species name honors Mark Mitchell, the museum technician who spent over 7,000 grueling hours removing the dinosaur from rock. Now, I'm not done with this one. There's just too much to talk about with this discovery to cram it into one point. So as I said, the Borealopelta was incredibly well preserved. It was covered in thick armor, especially around its neck. It also had these massive 20-inch spikes at the shoulders that were assumed to be for fighting, but Victoria Arbour, a curator of paleontology, also thought they might have been a display of health and strength, similar to the horns of a bull or tusks of an elephant. Now here's what's utterly crazy to me though. This dinosaur was so intact, they were able to see what was in its stomach. There were twigs and ferns in there, suggesting it ate during the wet season. Scientists think it could have been swept away by a flash flood, eventually sinking to the bottom of the sea. The body would have flipped over and sank, with its thick back and bloated belly causing it to be preserved in sediment, creating a natural time capsule that kept it safe for 110 million years. Here's another crazy thing about this find though. They were even able to determine, to a certain degree, what color the creature was. Most of the fossil was covered in relatively well preserved skin, and from this they were able to study pigment cells called melanosomes. Melanosomes are seen in nature all the time. It's what gives many modern day animals unique markings like spots and stripes. It's rare to see melanosomes in fossils, but again, Borealopelta was especially well preserved. At least one component of Borealopelta's color was this reddish brown, said Caleb Brown from the Royal Tyrrell Museum. The color on its back may have been part of a camouflage pattern called countershading, helping it blend into its environment and avoid predators. Now also in 2011, a team of paleontologists led by William Hammer discovered a new species of ancient dinosaur in the frozen mountains of Antarctica, an area that's usually thought of as one of the coldest places on Earth, but of course millions of years ago it was much warmer. The dinosaur was small, around 4 to 5 feet long, and had bird-like hip bones. It was likely related to early plant eaters like the Furbosaur and Heterodontosaur, which were the ancestors of larger and more famous dinos like Stegosaurus and Ankylosaurus. The fossils were found on Mount Kirkpatrick, part of the Central Transatlantic Mountains. Hammer and his team uncovered a leg and foot, but they weren't sure if they had found the dinosaur's head. It would take about a year to fully understand what they'd found. Thomas Holtz, a geology professor at the University of Maryland, noted that the find could help fill gaps in both dinosaur evolution and the ancient Antarctic environment, saying that this discovery was from a time when dinosaurs were just starting to take over, comparing these early small plant eaters to rabbits, fast, common, and without armor, but important to the overall evolution of the giant plant eaters that came later. Finding fossils in Antarctica is extremely challenging because of the harsh conditions and short research window. Hammer had been trying to return to the site since 1990, but bad weather and helicopter problems cut short his 2003 trip. As Holtz put it, anytime we find fossils there, it's a brand new species, it's practically unexplored territory. So these weren't the only dino remains William Hammer discovered in the mountains of Antarctica. In 1990, he and his team discovered a 22-foot meat-eating dinosaur called Cryolophosaurus. This was a big deal because it was the first dinosaur ever found in Antarctica. Cryolophosaurus was a meat-eating dinosaur that lived around 190 million years ago during the early Jurassic period. It was about 20 to 23 feet long, 6 to 7 meters, and weighed roughly 1,000 pounds. What really sets this dinosaur apart was its unique crest. The crest, found on the top of its head, had a very unusual shape, kind of like a frozen backwards mohawk. There are like two kind of things here. It's believed that the crest could have been used for display, either to attract mates or to communicate with other members of its species. As Hammer put it, it looked like a frozen crested reptile, which is how they got the name Cryolophosaurus, meaning frozen crested lizard. And again, in the early 1990s, William Hammer of Augustana College discovered more incredible fossils on Mount Kirkpatrick. These particular fossils included parts of a foot, leg, and ankle bones from a long-necked dinosaur that lived around 190 million years ago. It wasn't until much later, though, that the fossil was identified. The fossils were painstakingly removed from the ice and rock using jackhammers, rock saws, and chisels under extremely difficult conditions, said Nathan Smith, a graduate student at the Field Museum in Chicago. After a lot of hard work, Smith and paleontologist Diego Pohl realized they'd found a new species of dinosaur, which they named Glacialosaurus hammeri. This dinosaur was about 20 to 25 feet long and would have weighed between 4 to 6 tons. It belonged to a group called sauropodomorphs, which includes some of the largest dinosaurs ever. Think of those massive-sized, long-necked plant eaters. Around 20,000 years ago, a young woolly rhinoceros was going about its day in what's now northern Siberia. It was probably foraging for food when it made an oopsie and drowned in a river. Fast forward to 2020, and that same woolly rhino became a huge discovery for scientists. As rising temperatures cause permafrost to melt, creatures like this long extinct rhino are being uncovered, giving researchers a glimpse into prehistoric times. Permafrost is a layer of soil that's been frozen for thousands of years, great for preserving ancient remains. The woolly rhino's carcass was found by a local farmer in Yakutia, Siberia, about 15,000 years after the species went extinct. The fossil was incredibly well preserved, with its fur, hooves, and internal organs still intact. But what made this discovery even more special was the rhino's horn, which is rarely found in such good condition because cartilage usually decomposes relatively quickly. In 2018, a local man named Pavel Efimov made an incredible discovery in Siberia: the severed head of a giant wolf, perfectly preserved beneath the permafrost. But this wolf was nearly 40,000 years old. It wasn't until 2019 that researchers started studying it in detail. The big question they were trying to answer was whether the wolf's head had been chopped off by humans or separated by ice. The cut on the wolf's neck wasn't what you'd expect from ice separation. It was rougher, less smooth, meaning it might have been made by something like a tool. The severed head is quite large, measuring about 40 centimeters, much bigger than the typical 25 centimeter head of a modern Siberian wolf. It had a thick mammoth-like coat, sharp fangs, and some parts of its skull seemed more developed than today's wolves. In 2016, ornithologist Stephen Emsley made a surprising find during a research trip in Antarctica. He stumbled on ancient penguin remains at Cape Urzar near the Ross Sea, and what he discovered there was unlike anything he'd seen before. Now, at first, Emsley was researching ancient penguin remains at the site, following a lead about penguin droppings. He didn't expect to find much, since explorers like Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton hadn't recorded any penguin sightings in the area, but when Emsley arrived, he found something unexpected: white splotchy guano stains and loose chick bones, which usually indicate that a penguin colony had recently occupied the site, but that wasn't the case. Investigating further, he found complete penguin chick carcasses and even intact mummies. The site must have been covered by snow and ice soon after the colony was last abandoned, preserving the surface remains for centuries, Emsley went on to write. The site had been used by penguins at different times in the past, with carbon dating showing it was occupied 3 times starting around 5,000 years ago. The site's location and the penguins' repeated visits were likely because of changing ice conditions, which would open and close the coast to the penguins. Emsley believes that this area could potentially see penguins returning in the future as climate change melts the sea ice earlier each summer, giving them access to the coast again. In 2018, some fossil ivory hunters in northeastern Siberia made a pretty cool discovery. While digging into the permafrost, they unearthed the carcass of a bird, but this bird was a 46,000-year-old specimen, perfectly frozen in time. The discovery was sent to paleontologist Love Dallin and a team of researchers at the Swedish Museum of Natural History. The bird is believed to be an ancestor of the horned lark, which is found in places like northern Russia and Mongolia today. It's a cool find though, the first bird of its kind ever to be discovered. The fact that the bird was almost completely intact made it one of the best preserved ancient animals ever found. The bird was found near Balaya Gora, a village in Yakutia, an area known as the Pole of Cold because of its extremely cold winters, sometimes reaching as low as -60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly -50 degrees Celsius. That is just too cold. The researchers think that the end of the last ice age led to the formation of a new subspecies of animals like this bird. The discovery adds to a list of well-preserved creatures found in the same area, like a 42,000-year-old foal and an 18,000-year-old puppy, both of which I've talked about in previous videos.
Inside the pages of Injustice Year 1, penned incredibly by Tom Taylor, Joker gave Superman his one bad day. How'd he do it? Well, he used Scarecrow's fear toxin to convince Superman he was duking it out with Doomsday, one of the few beings in the universe that Kal-El doesn't have to hold back against. And at the end of the fight, Superman realized the mistake he had made. Turns out it wasn't Doomsday he was fighting, it was Lois Lane. He had harmed her to the point of death, along with what was growing inside of her. Now, you might think that was enough to set off Superman right then and there, but Joker decided to nuke Metropolis for good measure on top of it. Just because he could, for fun. Which I have a feeling is about to be a party line today. In the aftermath of Avengers vs. X-Men, Captain America formed a unity squad to unite the two groups into one. Instead of inspiring goodwill in the hearts of mutants and humankind alike, it inspired hatred in the heart of Red Skull, who decided he needed to exterminate all of mutant kind. In his first act of anti-mutant major crime, he used a superhuman named Honest John, who could manipulate people's minds to broadcast on national television that people needed to deal with the mutant threat, leading to a lot of killings across the country. Red Skull then upped the evil by swiping the brain of Charles Xavier, who was deceased at the time, and Red Skull merged the professor's mind with his own, giving himself the ability to send out a mass telepathic signal encouraging the people of New York to attack mutants. Yeah, I'm sure you can figure out how that ended up. In an issue of Sandman that DC itself billed as the scariest DC story of all time, Dr. Destiny took over a 24-hour diner and tormented its customers for an entire day. Using the power of Morpheus's amulet, Destiny mind-controlled the patrons of the diner to convince them to complete horrible deeds. Well, the highlight reel included one man chopping off his finger to feed to Destiny, another patron driving a nail into the hand of another, one of them ripping out a man's throat with their teeth, and ultimately all of them lying lifeless at Destiny's feet. The most horrific part of the whole ordeal is just how utterly pointless it all was. When asked why Destiny was doing it, he simply replied, "Because I can." And that might be the scariest reason of all, because it really shows how there's no humanity left in Destiny, if there ever really was any in the first place. What the Purple Man did to Jessica Jones was beyond evil. So his powers are pretty horrific. He can make anybody do what he tells them to do. When he used to make people give him their money or free food, it was often just a lightweight power. However, in Brian Michael Bendis' Alias, he did the worst thing imaginable. Jessica Jones, then known as Jewel, showed up to stop him, and he told her to sit down, and from that moment on, he kept her. In not a good way. While he never physically harmed her, he made her watch as he did awful things to other women. It was a form of torment that left her traumatized until he finally freed her, told her to attack the Avengers, and that left her in a coma. and kind of ended her entire career. So Old Man Logan tells a story of a future gone wrong. The villains have won. America's a wasteland. Wolverine lives a quiet life with his family, mostly left alone by the villains of the past, but is unwilling to help the heroes fight for tomorrow. Wolverine eventually reveals to Hawkeye what happened to him to extinguish his spirit. Turns out, during the villains' craziness against the heroes, Wolverine believed the X-Mansion was totally overrun by supervillains. So he fought hard and with lethal force, and when the fighting was done, Mysterio revealed that every villain that Wolverine thought he had slain was an illusion. Logan had been fighting against his friends. He stood horrified over the mangled remains of his closest buddies, all viciously taken out by his own claws. So Red Skull has just done so many awful things that I kind of had to mention him again today. So Red Skull used the powers of a woman named Kobik, which is a sentient cosmic cube, to replace Captain America's memories with a version of his life in which he's always been secretly loyal to Hydra. This led to the event known as Secret Empire, where Cap helps Hydra take control of the United States. Now this act was particularly heinous because it wasn't just a move against Captain America. It was a move against everybody who viewed the hero as a symbol of hope, including the outraged fans in real life. Even when Cap eventually returned to his usual America-loving self, the damage to his reputation was done. Like, I remember when this all came to light, way before I ever got interested in comics or heroes, and seeing all my friends in high school frothing at the mouth over how angry they were at this was really bad. Thanos Annual Edition number 1 revealed the dirtiest deed that Thanos ever did, and it all began with him helping an old lady cross the street. An unlikely beginning to the most evil act ever committed, but Thanos has been one to play the long game when needed. And hey, evil isn't always obvious. So the comic story reveals that during the time when Thanos possessed the Infinity Gauntlet, he was able to use the time gem to pinpoint the exact moment in which he might bring about the greatest number of deaths possible, besides killing half the universe with a snap of his fingers. This led the Mad Titan to a Manhattan street corner where Thanos delayed a bus driver with a glare and, as promised, assisted an elderly woman across the street. What no one realized at the time was that Thanos' apparent random act of kindness averted a chain of events that ultimately would have brought about universal peace. By delaying the bus, Thanos prevented a young woman named Stephanie Kircher from accidentally bumping into a woman named Suzanne, and this prevented the inspiration that would send Stephanie down a path to single-handedly ending world hunger and curing multiple diseases. These breakthroughs in turn would end numerous social ills and turn Earth into a paradise, whose example would inspire other worlds to abandon war and conquest. The twisted icing, or cherry on top of this cake of evil, comes years later, when Thanos visits Stephanie on her deathbed, to not just tell her of the life she would have lived and all the good that would have been done in her name had it not been for his intervention, but to show it to her in a vision. So because of Thanos, Stephanie lived an unaccomplished life and never came close to fulfilling her destiny. She died in tears, knowing for certain how truly wasted her potential had been, and how utterly meaningless her life was in the grand scheme of things, which is awful. There's nothing in the universe Reverse Flash resents more than the happiness of the Allen family. It's well known that Reverse Flash took out Barry Allen's mother, framed his father, but he actually took it a step further. Before dispatching Mrs. Allen, our bad guy systemically ruined the Allens' marriage and made them fall out of love. This both made it more believable to frame Mr. Allen for the offense and ensured that Barry would grow up in an unhappy home. Recently, Reverse Flash made it even worse by going after the other side of the family tree. He used his time travel abilities to befriend and radicalize Barry Allen's future offspring as adults. He then took them back in time to Barry Allen's present and had them destroy Barry's growing up home. Not only has Reverse Flash ruined Allen's past, but he made his future a nightmare as well. So I've already talked about it a bit today, but I know we're all familiar with Thanos' attempts, both in the MCU and the comics, to destroy a significant portion of all life to win the hand of death herself. But did you know he actually achieved his goal at one point and wiped out everything? In Donny Cates' run on Thanos, the title character goes into the future and meets a version of himself that was entirely victorious in his goal. This Thanos had spent thousands of years wiping out not just the heroes of Earth, but every being from every planet. The Black Hand is the leader of the Black Lantern Corps, where the fastest way to join is to kick the bucket. Depicted in Blackest Night, Black Hand began to build a legion of Black Lanterns, mostly comprised of heroes from Earth. He first went to the grave of Bruce Wayne, where he dug up his body and turned him into one of his mindless drones. After doing the same with, Martian Manhunter, he set his sights on living heroes and took out Hawkman, Hawkgirl, and the Elongated Man, who were also forced to join his Dark Legion. Desecrating the graves of Earth's heroes is kind of bad, but forcing them to become villainous zombies is evil enough to go kind of head to head with everything else we've talked about today.